Thanks so much, Kitty, for that introduction. Bernard Zolt, partner with KPMG based in Melbourne. My presentation today deals with a future vision. Yes, a future vision for Karratha, a future vision for Western Australia, for the Pilbara, and a future vision for Australia. In May of this year, I wrote a column in Australian Geographic, and I talked about the future of Australia and the need for nation building, city building, town building, and I cited the example of Karratha. It was a column, maybe 300 words or so. The impact of that single idea, the strength, the power of a single idea pitched well to the Australian people, I think is absolutely extraordinary. And it led to this piece on the Today Show. It only runs for 2 minutes, so I want to run it.
What do you think the population of Australia would be by then? In fact, it's tipped to be around 40 million. But how would our capital cities cope with all that extra pressure? Demographer Bernard Zolt says it's time we got a new city. And he joins us now. Bernard, you are in a creative frame of mind.
I am indeed. I'm in a nation-building mind, and I think we need a new city, a city of at least 100,000 people by the middle of the century, somewhere in the northwest of Australia, somewhere around Karratha, Port Hedland, maybe even as far north as Broome, but my money is on Karratha.
Okay, so how have you chosen that location, and is it an arbitrary figure? Why 100,000?
Well, I think 100,000 is realistic over a couple of decades. If you look at Karratha, for example, it's already 25,000, so I think it's achievable by 2050. The reason is that we have 100,000 fly-in, fly-out miners, workers at the moment, travelling from one side of the continent to the other, into the Pilbara. Now, I get that for some years because of labour shortages and so forth, but is this a permanent solution? We used to build towns back in the 1950s, the 1960s. In addition to that, I think there is a strategic reason why we might want better representation in the northwest. The Gorgon gas project off the west coast of Karratha is worth $50 billion in energy, and we do not have a military presence anywhere nearby. We need a town of some critical mass to exploit and develop and provide labour for the resources of the northwest.
Okay, and look, you know, when people talk about having a national project, they look back with the Snowy River scheme, and water projects are always popular when people think about these nation-building type activities. Building a city, I guess, encapsulates a whole heap of purposes.
Well, it does. We have done this before. Canberra, for example, was started in 1928. It now has 300,000 people. I think the idea for Canberra came at Federation, so it took 30 years for Canberra to talk about Canberra before it actually started. So we've had the Snowy Mountain scheme, we've had the Murray Irrigation scheme, the Ord River scheme in the northwest. We do these big national projects, and I think we need something nation-building for the 21st century. And I think it should be out of the southeast corner and up in the northwest. That's where the economic activity is and the strategic imperatives are for the coming century.
All right, so
I might leave it at that and build the argument as to why we might need a new city. If you are visioning Australia for the future, how might you do it? In this chart, I've looked at the number of people on the planet over 200 years. This is 1900 on the left, the end of the 21st century on the right. The total population going from 2 billion to 7 flattens out at around about 10 billion people on the planet by the end of the century. What does the planet look like in, say, 2070? In half a century's time, I think there will be a mad scramble for food, energy, resources, commodities. Here is, in fact, the demand for oil production or coal production or gas production. And I suppose Karratha and the Gorgon project would contribute to that. If the world population is going to increase to, say, 7, 8, 9 billion people by 2070, then surely gas production should be up here somewhere. The northwest, the Pilbara, iron ore and gas and commodities and resources is a space to be in, is my point. If you look at world population over the next half century, then Australia has what the rest of the world has or wants increasingly. Is Australia a good place to do business? Would you invest your money? If you are a major international corporate, where would you invest your money? Here is a list of the top 7 or 8 economies on the planet. The biggest economy, of course, is the US. About $17,000 billion in turnover, in GDP, every 12 months. China is currently around about half the size of the US in US dollars. In the year 2000, it was 1/3. In 1990, it was 1/10. And the argument is that by the middle of the 2020s, they will actually intersect. I think there are geopolitical implications for Australia and implications, therefore, for the Pilbara and Karratha. There's Australia. We're number 12. We're the 12th largest economy on the planet. We are in there, not at the top end, but we're in the middle, I suppose. That's not the issue. The issue, I think, is income per capita. When you divide GDP by the total population, which countries are the richest per person on the planet? And you need to eliminate small countries like Monaco and Liechtenstein. So if you eliminate anything with less than 3 million people, what are the top countries on the planet with critical mass, with income per capita, that can buy our stuff, if you like? And in fact, the richest country on the planet of some critical mass is Norway. 8 million people, $81,000 per man, woman and child, North Sea oil, of course. There's only 8 million. Then Australia, $67,000 per man, woman and child. Whether it's evenly distributed is not the point. The point is that we are extraordinarily rich. And then comes the Americans. Now, the Americans are only earning $53,000 per man, woman and child. Either we are overpaying ourselves or we are the most lucky people on the planet. And I think it's a little bit of both. Why would you not be in Australia? Critical mass, a rich country. But that's not the measure. The measure, I think, is the rate of growth over the last 5 or 6 years since the global financial crisis. Which countries have increased the most over the last 5 years? And the richest countries over the last 5 years, of course, has been our major trading partner, the major trading partner of the Pilbara, the major trading partner of Karratha. You simply don't have a country that pops out at the top of the fastest growing, richest countries on the planet and not have an impact on its supply lines. And the supply lines lead directly to Australia, directly to Pilbara, and directly into Karratha. As long as that figure remains up there, then that is good news for Karratha. Big picture, long term, is good for Australia. That is why Australia is number 2 in the second ranking, and probably why we're number 12 at the global ranking. Next chart, I wanted to bring it back to the US and super economies. Here is the American economy over 30 or 40 years, from 1980 on the left through to 2013, 2012 on the right. It's the American economy, and you can see it rises to about $17,000 billion in turnover in GDP. Here is the Chinese economy in comparison, and remember, this is what we have hitched our wagon to. This is what is propelling Australia, propelling the West, propelling the Pilbara, propelling Karratha forward. And you can see that's the trajectory. That is the trajectory that excites everyone, and you can see them intersecting perhaps in 2020. I think this raises some interesting questions. During the Cold War, we were scared witless of the USSR, of Russia. I want to show you the USSR, Russia, on the same scale, same time frame. We were scared witless that Russia had the capacity to actually take on the West. At no point did the USSR ever get to any better than 10% of the American economy. The Chinese alone are already at 33%. By 2025, the argument is 50%. By the middle of next decade, the whole geopolitics shifts, I think, as a consequence. Up until 2008, for 200 years, almost for 200 years, Australia's leading trading partner was our military protector. The Brits in the 19th century, and then the Americans literally from February 1942, Battle of the Coral Sea. And if it wasn't the Americans, it was the American allies, Japan. Japan, America, or Britain. Our military and our trade source were one and the same. In 2008, they diverged. We want military support from the Americans, and we want trade support from the Chinese. And we do not expect these two interests to intersect at any point throughout the 21st century. What would be the implications for the Pilbara, for Australia, if they were to intersect? I think there is another play here. Big picture, long-term visioning would say, I think there's military build-up issues here. Yes, it's food, energy, resources, commodities, space, security, lifestyle, health, education, all of that. Want to sell all that to the Chinese, the Indians and Southeast Asians, but I think there's a military play as well. And I think that will also unfold. in the northwest. And that was my point about the strategic implications of Karratha going forward. Here is what China will want. They want resources, then they want cities, then they want military representation, and then perhaps dissent. What is it that the Chinese people want after they get food and an apartment and a plasma television and a mobile phone and a motorbike? Then they want something else that Westerners have, and that is the right to an opinion. And I think that's going to be the most challenging of all for the Chinese government to deliver. Bring it back to Australia. What has the Australian nation done with the Australian continent over the last 21 years? From 1992 to 2013, 21 consecutive years. Here is rates of extreme population growth and extreme population loss. There are 78 red bits on this map, areas of population loss over 2 decades. And you can see we are retreating from the Riverina, the Wimmera, the Mallee, the Eyre Peninsula, the Upper and Lower Great Southern. The growth areas are largely the sea change coast. The only inland area of any substance that has decreased over that time, increased over that time, is this bit in outback South Australia, which is in fact the Woomera Detention Centre. So I wouldn't get too excited about the opportunities out there. Actually, the red bit in the middle of the blue bit is the Maralinga nuclear testing site from the 1950s. Big picture, high altitude demographics, positional demographics. I get it that most people here are running businesses. You want to know what the outlook is in 2014, 15, 16, 17. I get all that. Big picture, long-term trends. Where will Australia be in 2050, 2060? What are our geopolitical alliances? What will the rest of the world want? Food, energy, resources, commodities, space, security, lifestyle. What do we have? Food, energy, resources, space, security, lifestyle, health, education. That makes us a valuable commodity. I don't like the chances of 24 million people holding the resources of an entire continent in a time when our chief protector loses primacy and dominance over that decade. I think there will be tensions in the 2030s, 2040s. I would therefore expect to see military build-up. Obama was out here 3 years ago to establish a military presence in Darwin. We have Coburn Sound. We ain't got nothing in the northwest. And I think that this is a flaw in our defence systems. We have 6,000 soldiers sitting at Laverick Barracks in Townsville because of the Battle of Coral Sea, May 1942. You want your soldiers where the risk is greatest. Then you have Robertson Barracks, now augmented with the American Marines, 2,000 Marines, and then there's nothing, all the way through to Perth. And we've got the Gorgon Gas Project sitting off the coast here. When the Victorians started to drill for oil in Bass Strait in 1968, the RAAF headquarters in Melbourne was moved from Laverton to Sale. I reckon you could fly from Laverton to Sale in a jet fighter in probably 4 minutes. It's not a question of whether you can get there. This is a question of optics. The Australian people are talking to the region. We are prepared to put our money where our mouth is. Don't even think about it. I want to see a city of 100,000 people. I want to see a Laverick Barracks in the northwest. Personally, I don't care whether it's in Port Hedland or in Karratha or somewhere. I think that it's naive to suggest that the Australian people can claim the resources of an entire continent for another 100 years simply by relying on American dominance and primacy, while at the same time we want resources and wealth to be provided by the Chinese. I just don't see that that logic is right. And what we might do is beef up Karratha, 100,000 people. Why can't we nation build anymore in this country? Yes, we can build big projects like Parliament House and the East-West Tunnel in Melbourne with $10 billion or something like that. How about nation building outside the capital cities in somewhere like the northwest? Next chart, here is the number of people added to Western Australia over 50 years or so. That's 1982 through to 2009. Natural increase, excess of births over deaths. Overseas migration, the bit in the middle, you can see it pushing right up to 2009. And then interstate migration. The big picture view of Western Australia is this. In terms of migration, the West Australians have a greater chance of attracting people from across the Indian Ocean than from across the Nullarbor. At no point over the last 30 years, and I'd say 100 years, has any more than 10% of migrants to this state ever come from the east. The Nullarbor Plain is as effective a barrier as is the Berlin Wall. It stops people from the east getting into the west. I say, turn your back on the east and focus on the Indian Ocean rim. Focus on Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, China, and perhaps Europe in terms of sources of labour. This is the extraordinary boom. 70,000 people coming into the state in 2009. Kevin Rudd said, in that year, I believe in a big Australia, and it all hit the fan. There was panic in Canberra, and everything was wound back. Then it came back, 2011, 12, 13. Here is my estimates of 2014 based on 3 quarters of growth. And that is why everything feels as like it's slowing down in the West. And the question is whether it's going to drive down further or recover. I actually think it will recover. It might take 2 or 3 years, but the outlook over the next 2 or 3 years, I'm sorry to say, in the West has got to be moderated compared to where you've been over the last couple of years. Next chart, I just thought I would show some demographics for the West. Here is a list of the richest places in Western Australia, and in fact, Mardi, which is just south of Karratha, is in fact the richest place on the Australian continent in terms of average income per capita. It's a mining camp, of course, on the Fortescue River. And in fact, it's richer than Toorak, richer than Double Bay. Double Bay and Toorak, the average is about $3,000 per man, woman and child or family in Mardi. Then, of course, here is the mining communities. Across the Australian continent, 2% of the workforce is engaged in mining. But if you go to Paraburdoo, it's 65%. These, of course, mining communities. And you can see them all right throughout Western Australia. Roxby Downs, of course, in South Australia, and Dysart, I think, is in Queensland. The other one I like from the census is looking at the question of belief. There's a question in the census that asks people, what is their religion? 75% of the population said that they are Catholic or Presbyterian or Muslim or Buddhist, but in St George's Range, which is just south of Fitzroy Crossing, almost 90% are believers, God-fearing people in the interior of the Australian continent. Whereas if you go to Roebourne, which I think is technically in the city of Karratha these days, clearly the most godless place in the Pilbara. Very different belief systems in there. But again, I think this is probably a hangover from the missions, I would imagine, in fact. Next chart, here is Karratha. It's my favourite short-term demographic analysis, if you like, of any place, any city, any town. And it shows that over the last 10 years, Karratha has gone from 17 to 26,000 people, permanent residents. Doesn't take into account the masses of temporary residents sitting outside the community, of course. So Karratha has added 9,000 people, and here's where the bodies have been added. A bucket load of people in their 20s. Hardly anyone in their teenage years. This is a working town. And not many people hanging around into retirement. So you can see the model is you come in at 25, and by the end of your working life, you're out of there. Over the next 10 years, give you that short-term view, short-term, long-term. Karratha will add 8,000. You've added 9,000. You're going to add about another 9,000, 9,000. And that assumes that there is no national project to beef up Karratha going forward. And you can actually see where the population growth is going to be more kids. So the local council, of course, primary schools, secondary schools, childminding will be important. And also you'll start to get small evidence of retirees actually hanging around in Karratha going forward, and more people in their 30s. So just to give you a short-term outlook for what you can expect if you're in the building or development game up in Karratha. Next chart, I wanted to introduce you to what I call the Dubai effect. The reason why Dubai was such a successful city-state in the 1990s is that it was a safe haven in a troubled world. Make your money in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, but park your money, your family, your lifestyle, buy an apartment, live 3 months of the year in the safe haven of Dubai. The same thing applied, I think, between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. Russian billionaires do not live in Moscow. They live in Belgravia in London. I mean, if you're a billionaire, why would you live in Moscow? It's not really a world city. What you want is a world city, good quality of life, an overnight flight away, even 4 hours flight away from Heathrow. So there's a new wealth region. That Dubai serviced the Middle East. Moscow pretty much serviced Eastern and Western Europe. There is a new wealth developing region in the first half of the 20th century. And of course it is China, India, Southeast Asia. Make your money in Shanghai, Beijing, park your money, your family, your lifestyle, buy an apartment, live 3 months of the year, educate your kids, have a medical procedure, go to the casino in the safe haven of Perth or Melbourne or Sydney. I think what we will see is transnational residents, if you like. It already happened in the Middle East. It's already happened in Europe. Why wouldn't Australia? We are the closest overnight flight away. And so I think we'll see an increasing transnational population. People will have houses and accommodation in both cities, in both areas. And it's a risk mitigation strategy. I mean, if you've been successful in business in Shanghai, you've made a couple of mil, you want to get that out of the country. If it all hits the fan, then you can actually get down to Perth or whatever. So I actually see us feeding in food, energy, resources, commodities, space, security, lifestyle, and down the other way will come a demand for lifestyle, health services, education services, gambling services, gaming services, property services. So it's, the other point about this is that it's sort of illogical if we've got the Gorgon gas project sitting off here and God knows whatever other sort of connections directly into China. So you have to fly directly from Shanghai to Perth and then back up to Karratha. It's illogical. In the same way that in the late 1980s, the Japanese interest in far north Queensland, from Tokyo and Osaka down to Brisbane, then back up to Cairns, there is today a direct air link between Cairns and Osaka, Cairns and Tokyo. Why would there not be an international airport at Karratha connecting to Shanghai, connecting to Hong Kong, probably also into Denpasar as well? So military, aviation, logistics, city building, construction, mining. These are the drivers, the big picture, long-term drivers of growth in Karratha. There are 2.5 million people live in Western Australia. It controls almost half the Australian continent. With the best will in the world, 2.5 million people cannot deliver nation building like that. Certainly the cities of the Pilbara project, delivered by Brendan Grills, $950 million effectively, an extraordinary outcome. But the amount of money required is way above that. We need to leverage, we need to excite, we need to enthuse, we need to engage the Australian people in the legitimacy, the security legitimacy, the productivity legitimacy of a project, a national project. It's time for a national project in Australia. I think it's something in the northwest. I would see it for productivity, return on investment reasons. I see it for strategic reasons. But you cannot rely on the West Australian tax base. This must come out of Canberra, and you've got to sell the dream. And I suppose the reason why I was struck by that article in Australian Geographic was the ease with which it was like a wildfire. It just took off. The Today Show rang, and I must have done 20 interviews all around Australia, including Karratha, on this idea. You put a good idea to the Australian people, and they'll pick it up and run with it. And as I said, it took 30 years for Canberra, from federation to actually having Parliament sit in Canberra. Okay, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but I think we should be starting the discussion. I think it should be on the agenda to drive it forward. Next chart. In fact, I want to just finalise with some new research that I've done on the results of the 2011 census. This conference being held in Perth, I thought I would scan every suburb, every neighbourhood, every precinct across the greater Perth metropolitan area in order to find a very important point. Where is Perth's bachelor hotspot? Where is the highest concentration of eligible young bachelors in Perth? And by young, I mean 25 to 34, 5 years either side of prime marriageable age, and single, separated, widowed, never married or divorced. These boys are on the market. Where is the highest concentration statistically of eligible young bachelors in Perth? I've run the numbers. The highest concentration is located, actually not too far away, in Bentley. In fact, 1.78 eligible young bachelors per eligible young female. Clearly the Bentley pub on a Friday night is the place to be. I have in fact done this for every major city in Australia, including Melbourne, my hometown. The highest concentration in Melbourne is in a suburb known as West Footscray, and I have been told that the odds might be good, but the goods are odd out in... I would never say that about Bentley. I do understand, however, that it's next to Curtin University, so these are the Chinese, the Indian students. The boys are coming out, so the odds are good out at Bentley. You can do exactly the same analysis for eligible young women, and the highest concentration of eligible young women relative to eligible young men across metropolitan Perth is to be found in the suburb of Ellenbrook, up in the Swan Valley. 1.05 eligible young women per eligible young men. Of course, Ellenbrook, in order to get from Bentley to Ellenbrook, you'd probably have to take the Tonkin Highway, which I think should be renamed the Highway of Love, bringing together the boys of Bentley with the girls of Ellenbrook. Thank you very much.